Hello and welcome to Lecture 2, Part 2 of your unit on story structure, in which we discuss the classical Hollywood cinema. And here in our first slide, we have a still from one of the prime examples of classic Hollywood cinema, Casablanca from 1942. And Casablanca is an embodiment of all the story elements that we consider classical in classical Hollywood cinema. It's been influential as a narrative form since about 1920, which is around the time that movies started being feature length in the way that we know them. In other words, at least 80 minutes long, right? But usually longer, usually between 90 and 120 minutes. And it assumed its most elaborate and most traditional shape. We talked about Casablanca. Another example would be Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz. In those traditional American studio films from the classical studio era that lasted from about 1933 till about 1945. However, this is definitely a story form that travels because its elements are found not only in American films, but in many international films and even documentaries. Which brings us to the very, very important idea that classical, even though it typically refers to something that's older, that's been around for a while, classical also means contemporary, right? Because that exact same story structure, and we'll talk more in detail about what it means, is still being used in almost every contemporary film and TV show, including a movie like Hustlers, which we're going to study in this class, and a Star Wars film. So, what are some basic rules? We talked about some basic rules and elements of storytelling in general. In the last lecture, what are some basic rules for classical narrative? Well, first and foremost, classical narratives need to be clear. They need to feature clarity. And that basically means that viewers should not be confused about space, time, events, or character motivations. We need to understand what's happening and why people are doing what they're doing. Now, that does not mean that we need to have the answers to the plot in the first act, right? No. As we spoke of in the last lecture, a lot of the pleasure of storytelling is that some of the narrative is restricted and we don't learn things about what's happening until later, right? But it does mean that a viewer should not be sitting there scratching their heads like, what on earth is going on here? Because the bottom line for movies and TV is the bottom line. In other words, those movies are not going to make any money, right? And viewers are not going to trust movie makers who don't keep things clear. Unity, connections between cause and effect must be direct and complete. This thing happens and it results in this thing happening, right? Again and again and again until the movie's over, right? The movie needs to be connected by all these elements of storytelling that we've discussed in very, very clear and conventional ways. Characters should invite viewer identification. This is something we really haven't talked about yet. For the most part, characters should be sympathetic or empathetic, right? They definitely need to be active. They definitely need to be pursuing a goal. Otherwise, you don't have a movie, right? Because it's the pursuit of the goal and the obstacles that the protagonist encounters that create the story. Interestingly, the idea of viewer identification, that we need to identify with our main characters, especially as we follow them through the plot, has been tested in recent decades, right? Because we don't always like our main characters. And Breaking Bad is a great example. We've got this guy who's a criminal. He's a murderer. He's really not good to his family. He's not good to his community, but we still root for him. Why is that? Well, part of the reason why is because we have become so used to following the protagonist and rooting for the protagonist in a conventional narrative. We will still do that, even if they're not good people. So we have literally been conditioned by storytelling. And then closure. The last act and the epilogue, which is that little piece that comes after the climax, right after the conflict has been resolved. They should tie up loose ends and answer questions. Now, of course, a lot of movies also use the epilogue to set up sequels, right? What's going to happen in the next installment. Another very important element of classical Hollywood filmmaking, and this was really perfected in the classical era, during the time in which studio filmmaking was really streamlined to the point where it was considered almost like an assembly line, right? That the movies were made just like cars, with the pieces put in by craftsmen, and more or less the same thing would roll off the assembly line at the end. So Hollywood stories are told in a manner that draws viewers in the diegesis, and the diegesis is just a fancy word for the world of the story, everything that happens to the characters. And the most important part of this is that it does not call attention to the storytelling process, right? So filmmakers use formal properties such as editing, mise-en-scène, cinematography, and sound to create this seamless style that doesn't call attention to the storytelling. So if you ever wonder why you're able to get lost in a movie or TV show and kind of forget your surroundings, right? It's almost like our consciousness becomes part of what we're watching. We forget the world around us. It's because the unobtrusive craftsmanship of the filmmakers is doing everything it can to not call attention to the fact that you're watching a movie. And when you do get obtrusive craftsmanship, you'll notice it. So, for example, if somebody turns and looks right at the camera and starts talking, right, that's obtrusive. That will take you out of the story. So that's one of the reasons why you don't see things like that very often. Okay, another element of classical Hollywood storytelling, and this is not just necessarily classical Hollywood storytelling. This is a lot of storytelling, right? The three-act structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end. A pretty universal way of telling stories. So we have our first act, which introduces everything, right? We meet our characters, we understand their goals, we understand what they're up against in life, and that will end in a 2-hour movie at about the 20-minute, maybe 25-minute mark. You'll have a big turning point, an important change that affects the characters and situations and kind of spins the movie off into another direction, right? As the character really starts pursuing their goal and facing stiff opposition and resistance as they try to achieve it. These turning points in movies can be thought of as points of no return for the characters, where the initial situation can no longer exist, right? So, a very obvious turning point would be when Superman's planet explodes at the end of the first act of Superman, right? There's no going back. Character is forced to go forward, achieve new goals, and find new equilibrium in his universe. Act 2 is the longest act in any story. This is where we have the complications, all the developments, the cause and effect, the tit for tat, right? The protagonist meets obstacles, often the result of an antagonist, that prevents her from reaching her goals, right? And when she does, what does she have to do? Well, she has to find new ways to pursue those goals. And that's how our story is told. And the conflicts increase, in number and complexity, leading to a major turning point, often referred to as the climax, right? And the climax is when the conflict is resolved. Sometimes it's through combat, sometimes it's through a character overcoming their personal demons or whatever. But you'll know, right? Because it's the highest point of tension, and it always comes near the end. And then we can think of Act 3 or maybe Act 4 sometimes as the denouement. In other words, the little bit at the end in which everything is tied up. And then some film scholars and screenwriters prefer to think of feature films as being comprised of four-part structure. The major difference is that the four-part structure features an extra turning point known as a midpoint, which happens at the dead center of a film. So, and I will often, I've become so adept at analyzing movies and TV that I can often tell you when the midpoint has arrived without knowing how much of the movie I've watched. And then I'll pause it and I'll say, wow, yeah, we're right at the midpoint. It's a 120-minute film and we just hit the 60-minute mark. Why I'm able to tell that? Because it's always a major twist or turning point that changes the nature of the protagonist's situation and forces him or her to try a new way to resolve their problem. So as writers, this is definitely something you want to start thinking about and learning to master. So just as an example of what I was talking about in Jaws, the midpoint comes at minute 60 of a 120-minute film. The hero realizes that he will have to kill the shark at sea. So for the first 60 minutes of Jaws, we have our inciting incident, right? Our initial incident when the shark attacks, and that gives our protagonist a goal to stop the shark attacks, to kill the shark, right? He tries a bunch of different things up until minute 60, and there's another big attack, and he realizes it's not going to work, right? He's going to have to try something different. And so that's when he charters a boat and he goes out and tries to kill the shark at sea. The turning point, also known as a reversal, sends the film off in another direction. The initial situation can no longer exist until equilibrium is restored. Now, in Lady Bird, there's a very subtle turning point. It's not as right in your face as a shark attack, but it does create a change for Lady Bird in the way that she interacts with people. And so I want you to see if you can spot that when you're watching it. Moving on. What is exposition? It's just a fancy word for setup. Act 1 of a film is often dense with narrative detail, backstory, and plot setup, and sometimes you'll find yourself bored the first 20 minutes of a movie, or maybe even the whole first episode of a TV series that ends up being pretty good eventually. And it's because they're just loading in too much exposition without giving us any drama, right? And so a good writer tries to give us drama and interest while they're orienting us to the story world. So I'm watching a very good show on Netflix right now called Good Girls. It's an NBC show that's also on Netflix, and it's basically about these three working class women or suburban women that end up committing crimes because they need money so bad. And we are oriented to their story and their characters in a way that's very entertaining and compelling right from the opening minute, right? So that's a good example of strong writing. Okay, so there are other kinds of storytelling in the world. It's not all just classical, right? A number of narrative filmmaking traditions have modified or rejected the rules of dominant Hollywood method of storytelling. People, artists, writers, right, they want to be able to convey other things about the world than whatever Hollywood's typical storytelling machine has to convey. And this is what we think of as maybe art films, right? Indie films, although a lot of indie films do also conform to classical Hollywood. Non-Western films, films made in other countries. And unconventional Hollywood films. There are definitely there are definitely big filmmakers in the world that experiment with different kinds of narrative. Quentin Tarantino being one of them. He uses a lot of circular storytelling. He uses a lot of flashbacks, right? Uh, his not out. His movies tend to be very long. They have very long scenes with lots of dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue calls attention to itself. So he's often breaking these rules because he wants to tell a different kind of story. Christopher Nolan might be another example, right? He's often experimenting with narrative in a movie like Inception or his most recent movie Tenet. And then there are just, frankly, experimental films, avant-garde films, as they're sometimes called. Andy Warhol, the pop artist, was a filmmaker, and he would make films about people getting their hair cut or just sleeping, right? He was trying to express something about the world or capture something about the world that didn't have anything to do with conventional storytelling. But we still consider those films. So some examples of rejecting these traditional Hollywood narrative rules include lack of clarity. We don't always know what's going on. Multiple conflicting lines of action, inconsistent characterization, people doing things that we don't understand. Why they're doing it, we might eventually learn why they're doing it, but for a while we might be confused. Extreme degree of character subjectivity, right, where we don't see much of the story world at all outside of the perspective of the protagonist. Lack of unity, broken chains of cause and effect. A good example of that is Mulholland Drive, David Lynch's film. It seems like a traditional narrative, but then really, really starts going in an almost dreamlike fashion where things are happening and they're kind of connected, but not quite. And of course, Lynch is trying to convey and create a different kind of story that has different things to say about the world. That the world is not linear. That the world is not orderly. That the world does not go the way we want it to, right? That all these things, sort of invade our lives that we don't always understand. So it's an example of using the form to create content or theme. Unconventional characterizations, we talked about that earlier, right? The audience is distanced from characters rather than invited to identify. So There Will Be Blood, a great example, right? Paul Thomas Anderson's movie with Daniel Day-Lewis as an oil baron who's really just a kind of an awful person. And yet he's so fascinating, we still kind of want to spend those 2.5 hours with him. Unclear character goals, unreliable narrator. I won't spoil it for you, but The Usual Suspects is famous for having an unreliable narrator. Devices such as direct address that call attention to the narrative process. People that break the fourth wall, as it's known, speak right to the camera. See this in a couple of different Spike Lee movies, like Do the Right Thing and 25th Hour. Ferris Bueller is a good example, right? He talks right to the camera. So artists like to experiment with form, even within conventional Hollywood. And then there are some films that are very open-ended. They conclude without resolution. No Country for Old Men is a great example of this. It's very, very classical Hollywood until the last act, and then it leads up to sort of this anticlimax, where the villain and the heroes seem like they're headed for a showdown, as in a traditional Western, but it never happens. And that's the way that the Coens are using the form to say, in the real world, good does not vanquish evil as often as we would like, right? Frame narration, Citizen Kane, The Princess Bride, consists of a character who narrates an embedded tale to on-screen or implied listeners. So in The Princess Bride, for example, it starts with, a grandpa telling his grandson a story, and then we go into that story, and then episodic narratives. Again, Tarantino, right? Events are not tightly connected. We definitely see this in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, right? He sort of brings everything together at the end, but he also just likes to kind of hang out in these spaces that he creates. He's not in a hurry always to get to the next beat. Diegetic versus non-diegetic elements. We talked about diegetic elements. Diegesis is a story world, right? Everything that exists in the world that the film depicts. And these are important ideas, diegetic and non-diegetic, because they're going to play a big role when we get to our unit on sound. So just kind of file these away for later. But the diegesis is everything that's implied on screen and off screen in the world, right? Settings, sounds, character events, everything that the characters are aware of. Non-diegetic elements are elements within the film, but not within the film's world. So that's, the credits, for example, that roll over the opening scenes. Like the characters can't see those, right? But they exist in the movie. Voiceover narration. You might have somebody giving a voiceover narration, but the other characters can't hear it. So very common non-traditional elements. And filmmakers use non-diegetic elements for several reasons. They may draw attention to aspects of the narrative from a position outside the story. They communicate with the audience directly, and they can engage viewers on an emotional level. So examples would include the voiceover in Shawshank Redemption. Right? Do we really need Morgan Freeman telling the whole story? Because we more or less see the story unfold, right? And yet it becomes such an important part of the emotional texture of the story, right? His point of view about his friend. The opening crawl of the text in Star Wars, of course, became very famous and is used in every Star Wars movie. The words that go up on the screen, and then printed pages. Wes Anderson, he likes to use non-diegetic elements, like in the Royal Tenenbaums, right? Here's chapter 1. Okay, and that is the end of our lesson on story structure. Just as a reminder, I do have the PowerPoints linked separately. So if you want to download those, in case you need to, grab out a slide or two and not go back through the entire lecture, you're more than welcome to do that.